the floodgates to all sorts of irresponsibility, to being an exemplar of everything that philosophers do wrong when they have to do with politics, and so on and so forth. And I didn't agree necessarily with the tone and form of Agamben's interventions, but I did think they were a good occasion to go back to his very serious and very enlightening, I think, engagement, especially with Hobbes, with the relationship between plague and civil war in Hobbes's own translation of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, and then Agamben's own engagements with all the debates around the iconography of the Leviathan, which is something I've been interested in for a while. And in particular, I suppose what I wanted to draw attention to was this, I think, quite unique and suggestive idea of Agamben that doesn't, necessarily appear as prominently in his own recent pieces, which is this idea of ademia, or of the absence of the people, or the emptying out of the people, and this logic of separation and evacuation, which is related to the plague state, in a sense. So I guess that was my interest. I suppose maybe another thing perhaps to reflect upon, I mean, it's not something that I addressed directly in the piece, was to think about the extent to which the debate about biopolitics and about sovereignty that has been so central to critical theory over the past couple of decades, certainly in the wake. So I suppose another line of inquiry might be to think the extent to which Agamben's own treatment of the biopolitical needs to be supplemented with a critical treatment of questions of epidemiology.
Excellent, awesome, thank you, Alberto. So currently there are no other questions, and so I would like to encourage any of the participants here right now to go ahead and ask away. And so Alberto, this, hold on, let's see, I might have one more question here. Let's see, this is in the chat function. Hold on.
Yes, Clint wants to know about whether I could develop this idea of dual biopower further. That's as far as I can see in the chat. Okay. Yeah, so should I? Yeah. Okay, well, that's that again is another effort, I suppose, to stretch or supplement, and perhaps also to criticize by doing so, the discussion of biopolitics that we're familiar with, which is in a sense to bring attention to the political, but also the theoretical history of efforts to think of the ways in which the state's own formative involvement in the nexus of health and law, and with everything that entails, has also been the concern of a whole welter of anti-systemic movements of various sorts, and not all of them by any means emancipatory or progressive. But it is evident, it seems, that when there is not necessarily a crisis of sovereignty as such, but nevertheless a disturbance in the biopolitical identification of state, territory, and population, spaces do open up for the co-presence within one territory, within one polity or jurisdiction, of different ways of relating to questions of public health, epidemiology, and so on. At the end of the talk, I gave, I think, what is one of the more, I suppose, iconic and inspiring examples of this, which is the various forms of the so-called survival programs that the Black Panther Party engaged in the early 1970s, especially in Oakland and on the west coast of the United States, but elsewhere too, as one of those examples. But I think, whenever we see a troubling of political sovereignty and control also over public health, these are openings that are generated. And part of the reason why I wanted to bring this up was also to consider the ways in which the present crisis is also an occasion to explore the ways in which collectives, communities, or groups engage, sometimes experimentally, sometimes just by lack of any dutiful presence of the state itself in these biopolitical or epidemiological practices. And some of this comes out of recent debates in literature on the way in which epidemiological responses, for instance, to the Ebola crisis in Western Africa were very much dependent on forms of community politics that weren't necessarily overseen or subsumed by the state. Now, of course, this is not either license to or a suggestion to let the existing states that claim to represent us off the hook for their often kind of criminal incompetence in matters epidemiological. But I do think it's important, in order to expand our political imaginaries of exactly what political responses to these crises might be, to think in that direction. The effort to do so was something that I tried to do also in other texts and other places, by thinking in particular through, in a response to a very interesting intervention from a few years ago, which was Frederick Jameson's text, An American Utopia, which I recommend people read or return to if they've already read, because one of the striking things about Jameson's text is that he establishes as the anchor for a kind of utopian thought experiment within the context of the United States, the health or biopolitical dimensions of the US military, as in a sense, the speculative or science fictional source, we could say, for a different kind of political imaginary. But it's very striking that it is a utopian imaginary or a utopian dislocation that takes place through the standpoint of health. And I guess there again, with reference to Agamben, I think one of the things that is perhaps problematic in Agamben's treatment is that you have, on the one hand, a biopolitical nexus, which is also a thanatopolitical nexus, where the state and state power is articulated around the thresholds, the legal or juridical thresholds between life and death. And then on the other hand, you have what is an ethical imaginary in Agamben of what he calls forms of life that don't provide the state with any surfaces for its inscription or its practice. But I guess what I find, in a sense, missing or absent in the kind of constellation of concepts that Agamben advances is precisely the notion of a much more fine-grained account of what a non-state biopolitics might be. And I guess that was where the notion of dual biopower was also trying to operate.
So Alberto, Clint has put another thing in the chat.
Yeah. Maybe Clint can find the cartoon that he's referring to, because I'd like to. Yeah, it's a good prompt. The joke or the cartoon is a good prompt to think about the blind spots or the medical unconscious of U.S. power, perhaps.
So Alberto, I have a question for you, and this is not very well formed, but it's something that I'm thinking about here in the U.S. So like you know, just within the last couple of days, we're seeing how China is asserting its authority in Hong Kong and imposing these, you know, some writing essentially new laws in the name of public health, right? That are eventually, you know, that are going to squash the pro-democracy movement there in China, right? And you have this quote, and you have a quote that says, "The health of the people should be the supreme law," right? And this is the biopolitical imperative, right? And this is the ethical maxim with which China is imposing its state of exception in the name of public health to squash the pro-democracy movement, right? Yet now in the United States, you have a nice contrast where instead of really robustly invoking a state of exception, there's an imperative to keep things normal, return to normal, right? And so you also let's see. I think, you know, you can contrast the health of the state and in what China is doing with like the health of the economy in the U.S. So it's like the major the major like kind of demand of the state demand here in the United States is the health of the economy is what's most important, not the health of the state necessarily.
Mhm.
And so what this means is, you know, go back to work. And so this has been, you know, highly criticized by a lot of epidemiologists and people on the political left, like Paul Krugman, who says, oh, you know, yeah, we should go back to work and sacrifice hundreds, you know, tens of thousands of people potentially for the Dow Jones Industrial Average, right? And he says this is how conservatives are thinking of what will happen, but they won't say it directly, but saying we'll have to sacrifice people in order to get the economy moving again. And of course, what's obviously not said at all is the immense racial disparities of the people who end up, you know, the vulnerable populations in the United States that are being hit the hardest by the virus, right?
Thank you very much, Chris. There's a lot of food for thought there. I mean, one aspect of it, I guess, is what we could see as a kind of biopolitical antinomy in the sense of the co-presence, but also incommensurability between two different principles that coexist in the same space and time, namely that of the value of life and that of the reproduction of a particular system of accumulation, distribution, or what have you. And that, I mean, it's an antinomy, but obviously those in a society that is, so to speak, subsumed by capitalist relations, it's also very much a fact in a sense. Of course, if the state is incapable or unwilling to supplement the incomes that a full cessation of large swathes of economic life leads to, then it is true that under those conditions, economic death, social death, and actual death have a very continuous relationship to one another, and a relationship that I think you very justly point to the racial and class and gender determinants of, which are shockingly present not just in the U.S. I mean, I live in the United Kingdom, and it's though of course the racial regime here is of a very different sort and of a very different history, nevertheless it's also a shocking situation in that respect. And I think so that's one element that obviously this brings to the fore, and it's quite striking, I guess, on a daily basis. You have brought to the fore, not that I think epidemic is necessarily a kind of great moment of revelation, as I said at the beginning, but you do have brought to the fore in everyday news, conversation, etc., quite explicitly this discussion, like, should life come before the economy or the economy before, it's like what you hear if you turn on BBC Radio 4 at 7 in the morning or whatever. That's what you hear, and you hear this, and it's quite interesting too. That I think even in the U.S. actually, to the extent that we accept polls as a decent indicative of some general flows of feeling or whatever, that actually the vast majority of the population, for better or worse, seem to value the survival over accumulation kind of bit of the equation. But of course, it's not it's an antinomy, but one in which these things are locked in together. And so you've had on the one hand what seemed to be certainly here relatively exceptional, if temporary, moves by the state, pay the salaries of millions of people who are forced to be out of work, at the same time as there is a real, sorry here, pardon me, sorry, FaceTime turns itself on its own. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Sorry, where are we? Okay. What I was, so one of the things I guess that I also wanted to address in that question is the issue of how this question of the pandemic and this biopolitical question is also then captured by not just the discourse, but I suppose the juridical framework, the state framework of states of exception, emergency, and so on. So this was, for instance, in Spain, where this is much more formal, constitutionally speaking, they've had to, they have to legislate to maintain they have three different, they have a state of alert, one of emergency, one of alarm, I forget the exact terminology, but they have to implement those. So it's also, I think, something worth reflecting on, that the moment of crisis, so to speak, does get rather automatically translated into and captured by a moment which, in a sense, has very little to do with the epidemiological requirements of the situation, which do involve, I think, a different mentality. But then nevertheless, in as much as it's a crisis, that state power has to deal with, it's always, in a sense, the same crisis, not just at the level of metaphor, but at the level of some of the juridical moves being taken, the same crisis as a war or a civil war or an insurrection, even though in its ontology it bears no relation, almost no relationship whatsoever to these phenomena. No? And I think that's quite striking. I mean, in the case of Italy, which is where I'm originally from, one of the things that was really evident, not just, again, at the level of mentality, but of political praxis, was the extent to which there was a reflex to immediately militarize the whole situation. So bizarrely, you had city squares in Milan with, armored trucks, people with machine guns. It's like, in a situation actually where the level of social compliance was fairly extreme. I mean, contrary to, Italians' reputation for, wayward or illegal behavior. There was the compliance was, quite thorough, so to speak. But nevertheless, the response was this kind of very militarized response. And so that's, I guess, another thing that's happened also in terms of these differences, bringing out these often inchoate imaginaries of emergency as well as embedded practices. So in the Italian case, the reflexes are reflexes that have been the case in Italy, for instance, since the season of so-called, terrorism armed struggle in the 70s, which is that, it's quite common to see the police out with machine guns. And so they'll do that even if they're dealing with a viral pandemic, which has absolutely no use for, military force. So, so I find that phenomenon quite striking. So there's this kind of oscillation between, on the one hand, the demand to militarize, or the demand to bring a kind of classical, almost military imaginary and practice of sovereignty out. And then on the other hand, the imaginary and practice of, release the flows of capital and goods and commodities and so on. And we seem to be in a very bipolar, maybe rather than antinomic relationship between these two. And sometimes, so for instance, even in the moment of hardcore militarization of this in Italy, at the same time, of course, sort of sotto voce, what was happening is that basically the state was colluding with the fact that people were being forced to go to work under completely unsafe conditions. So one of the things that happened that got talked about less, actually, was a whole series, for instance, of wildcat strikes in factories where people couldn't get any PPE equipment. Of course, you also have this phenomenon of sudden visibility. It's one of the first times that you see prison revolts or prison conditions being dealt with, people being released from prison that would have never been released from prison before, because all of a sudden they were a public health risk, which is kind of interesting. So clearly they weren't very much of a risk at all if the fact that they might spread corona was like infinitely worse than whatever reasons they had for being kept in jail. So, a lot of these things have kind of emerged, but I think at the same time, there's a real inertia in the political and juridical practices, as well as the imaginary that goes along with it. And I think very little sense of the, not just political, but I guess epidemiological necessity for people to take, for people to have a kind of participatory relationship to the living with, because that's in a sense what it is, isn't it? Not the suppression, but the living with something that might be endemic for a while. And that's another element which I think is quite difficult to assume, is the kind of temporality of this. So you do have, the temporality of the state and of the political, which is, an electoral temporality, very much in the case of the United States and elsewhere, which overdetermines this extremely. Then you also have a temporality that is of a more, of an epidemiological sort, so the time of the virus, which is now a kind of indefinite time, and these waves or non-waves, and et cetera, et cetera. And then you have the, the temporality of the economy, of business cycles, and so, and I think the relationship between these two is between these three is turning out to be a really extreme conundrum for all sorts of different social actors to engage with.
Yeah, no, that absolutely, that's very helpful to think about the situation, these different temporalities, and how in a way, like that, well, just in the sense that it creates like distinct temporal trajectories that normally are cohere together, right? And all of a sudden you have these different tracks, right? The time of the virus, the political process, which is supposedly on track in the United States for the election, like the presidential election in 2020, and then the real of the virus and the time of the virus itself, right? So I don't see any other questions right now, but I would like to, once again, put out the invitation to ask a question if you're still here listening to us. Please do. And so, as I just maybe wait a little bit more to see if anyone asks a question, one thing that you mentioned, Alberto, which I found really interesting, is that on the one hand, there's a military imaginary, right? But that also gets enacted, like you said, in Italy. The military imaginary does actually translate to a militarized response, right? However, in the US, you can say that a political figure like Trump, he can benefit from using the rhetoric of war, but he would never go anywhere towards actually doing something on the ground, like fulfilling the military imaginary.
Hmm. Hmm.
He can mobilize it as a rhetorical strategy. Whereas in Italy, it goes beyond just a rhetoric, but it actually creates a material reality. But in the US, it's just a pure rhetorical ploy. But it
Well, you
does.
could, yeah. I mean, you could even say more. I mean, I suppose the Italian one is a kind of military imaginary. It's a police practice, let's say, which is
Okay.
often, as police practices are, full of holes and peculiarities, but and then also this bizarre bureaucratic libido that forces everybody to every day print new certificates for going out to walk their dog and the like. Also very interesting, this idea that everybody in the world has printers in their house and that they can keep printing documents and bringing them to the cops if the cops stop them, etc. So that's just kind of more anecdotally. I suppose even weirder in the US case is, of course, is that what I was talking about in a more emancipatory horizon in terms of this idea of dual biopower, forms of epidemiological knowledge and practice on the basis of communities themselves. My example was, of course, that of the Black Panther Party, who, amongst other things, were quite famous for engaging these quite spectacular uses, displays of force that actually didn't involve any real military or violent threat at all, like when they famously showed up, I think it was at the state capitol in Sacramento, in California, with shotguns and so on, because it was legal, And of course, that's one of the, in a completely different part of the political and indeed racial spectrum. That was a kind of the image of the Michigan Capitol that you had of a situation which is really uncanny in terms of the framework that I put forward, because it's basically people who support executive power, i.e. Trump in this case, but who nevertheless show up at these state legislatures that they're opposed to because they're Democratic, blah blah blah. In full. I mean, not just like the Black Panther mode, which had a bit more of a spectacular one, just like dressed up like Marines on a war footing, with the full, paraphernalia, the camo, the masks, and everything else. And that's a very weird, it's a very weird phenomenon that's taking place in the United States in that regard, where that the military imaginary is not because it's very specific to the United States. It's of course the imaginary of the militia, isn't it? Which is obviously a very common right-wing political form or far-right political form in the US. Link then to all of these notions about the armed citizenry that go back to fantasies of the racialized fantasies of the Constitution and what have you. And so I think it's been a very peculiar moment, partly because, of course, it articulates a language which is a very weird language of liberalism, isn't it? It's like I would, the slogans, the quotes from Thomas Jefferson, and I'd rather give up my security than my liberty, so that in that case, in a weird sense, the Hobbesian, the Cicero sentence that Hobbes uses is refuted, isn't it? It's like, no, actually, freedom rather than health. That seems to be the or even better. There was that one placard that one of the protesters dressed in some sort of weird American flag outfit. She had a placard that said "social distancing equals communism," which I thought was just quite poetic in its own way. But in any case, there's a very sui generis short circuit around these issues, I think, in the United States that makes one's discussions, I guess, of issues of health, biopolitics, and sovereignty quite peculiar, because it is a very different political imaginary in many ways, or a very different fantasy space as well, than the one that takes place in different countries in continental Europe.
Right. It's a cultural difference that leads to a different social imaginary and fantasy space.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that we may as well wrap this up.
Yeah.
There are some the conference organizers have posted some links to some of your
Yeah,
talk.
they're links. They're basically links to some of the images from Hobbes that I was referring to, because I was too scared to start doing screen sharing or whatever, so I figured I'd keep it simple. But if people want to look at those images, for instance, of where the plague doctors are in the frontispiece of the Leviathan and so on, they're linked there, as well as a short piece about Agamben and Hobbes that develops that part of the paper in a little bit more detail.
Wonderful. Alberto, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Chris, for hosting it, and thanks to all of the participants for taking the time.
All right, take care.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.